Hello, everybody, and welcome to this session, Creating a Vocabulary-Rich Environment with Rachel Mortlock. We're delighted that you've joined us. This is the last of the in-person webinars that you're doing for us in this series, Rachel. And I know some of you will have joined us for those who are on the call today, but you can also view the previous sessions on our YouTube channel as well. On YouTube under DNEY Hub, if you'd like to see any of the earlier ones. I'm just going to start by just letting you know, for those of you who are in a PVI nursery session, we are actually going to be joined at the end by Blanche, who is from Nelly. And she's going to be talking to you about an opportunity that you may have read already about an opportunity to take part in an early years trial that is free of charge, but it's based around evidence-based intervention to ensure children in your care have strong oral language foundation to start formal education. The places are fully funded, so there's no cost to you. So if you'd like to know more information about that and hear about that, please stay on after this session for no more than 15 minutes, just for Blanche to talk you through that. But for now, we're going to focus on this. And I'm going to hand over to Rachel, who will take you through it. Thank you very much, Rachel.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. It's nice to see some people back from before. I think we've got somebody who probably needs to mute. That's okay.
Yeah, I can just ask
the noise
you to
stop. That's perfect. So we're going to look at creating a vocabulary-rich environment in early years, and we're going to look at how we plan for vocabulary development, how we explore language, and the role of the adult in supporting children to develop. As with the previous sessions, we're going to be using some films and video from Siren Films, and they go from birth, the films that we're going to look at, through to reception and the end of reception. And the Stronger Practice Hub has arranged that you can have access to Siren Films. So if you want, you can contact them and you can get a log on. I've set up all of the videos as playlists within it, so you can look at the individual videos that we've looked at, but there are hundreds and hundreds of other videos as well to have a look at on there. Everything from engaging with babies to evidence what early learning goals would look like in reception, for example. So if you haven't taken up the opportunity to have that subscription, then please do. After the meeting, you will be sent the PowerPoint. It also has notes pages. So everything that I'm going to say is within the notes pages. If I link to something else, I've put the link within those notes pages. And if I'm quoting from a larger document, I've put the wider information that I'm quoting from in terms of those. And it will have, as well, as you can see, there's a little blue link at the bottom of this page, but it will have the direct link if you've already set up your access with Siren Films to be able to watch the videos within Siren Films. So we're going to start by thinking about how children learn to talk. I'm just going to take my image off the screen just so that we can see the whole screen effectively, but I'll pop up at different times as we go on. So when we're thinking about how children learn to talk, it starts right from the beginning. So from the very beginning, as soon as babies are born, they learn to speak by listening and repeating the sounds that adults make, and responding to adults and connecting the sounds that adults are making to meaning. And it's within the first 2 years of life that development is really, really rapid. And when toddlers, typically developing toddlers' brains and focusing on connecting those sounds that they're hearing all around them to words and developing a meaning for them. And babies learn to talk by listening to and repeating the sounds made by adults. And at this point, really young children, they don't consciously distinguish individual sound units or phonemes when they're hearing those spoken languages. And there's research that says slightly different things around how children learn language. So some say that that if they hear the sound ball, for example, at the same time as seeing a ball, it helps children to associate the two. And other research suggests that children can map meaning to a word after experiencing it only once or twice. And if we're thinking about the progression within there, children are going from speech to language to comprehension. And a child develops understanding of speech through exposure to that language and opportunities to practice that exchange with adults. And the very first video that we're going to have a look at, it's really short. It's an interaction between a grandmother and her grandchild, and it's a very young child.
मला किसने मारा? किसने? मम्मी नहीं आई आपके अभी? पापा भी नहीं आए आपके? नहीं आए? पापा भी नहीं आए? दूसरे घर चले गए? हाय सबके, हाय सबके। आप किसके बेटे हैं? अल्लाह अल्लाह अल्लाह।
So what we saw in the video then was a child who was only a few weeks old, but we could already see they were responding to the noise that the adult was making and responding back. So that two-way conversation, that serve and return, even though the baby wasn't at a point of having formal language yet, was already starting. So children want to, they want to communicate, and they start to communicate from the very day that they're born. And within the first few years, they begin to talk. And most or many children do that without any effort at all. But some children take much longer and appear to be slower to start speaking compared to others around them and need more support. And we're going to look at some of the more support that children might need as we go through as well. So as children start to learn, they're starting to make sense of the world around them, and they're starting to attach meaning or language to words that they start to hear. And if we start to think about why is this important, right back in 1970, there was a quote that reading and writing float on a sea of talk. And developing children's understanding of language is vital for teaching children to be able to read and write. And there was a report published in April 2021 called Speak for Change by the RC All-Party Parliamentary Group that talked about the impact of the pandemic on an already marked language gap. And we're going to have a look at that and explore that a little bit more in a minute. But we know there's a gap between the language and the vocabulary that children will enter a setting or a school with. So whether they're 2, 3, 4, 5, or even older, we see there's a gap. And anecdotally, and there is starting to be some emerging research as well, it seems to be getting more challenging post-pandemic. Children have been out, children have missed education, they've missed some socialization, they've missed some of those vital first steps. But the general view when you talk to most practitioners are that children are coming in with lower language skills, more children are potentially coming in to nursery schools and nursery settings, so age 3, who might need more support with toilet training, and that generally a lot of parents are needing more help and support as well. So if we're thinking about how we support children as we go through, then we need to think about how we make sure that we meet the children at the point at which they join us. So from the point at which a child starts with us, we identify quickly where their language and communication skills are, and we build upon those. Now, I'm sure you'll have seen the research on the next slide before, and it was published in the mid-90s, and it's the heart research, and it was done, there's a bit of a caveat, there's a big caveat around this research. So it's the research that talks about that children from deprived backgrounds are exposed to 30 million fewer words than children from advantaged backgrounds before they start school. There is a bit of a caveat about it, that it was done in a very particular, it's quite a small study, and it was done within a very particular group of families within North America. And although other researchers tried to replicate it, they haven't managed to get to the 30 million fewer words, but they have found that generally children from deprived backgrounds have less exposure to as much vocabulary and as much rich vocabulary as children who are from more professional families, who it found had gained vocabulary at a quicker rate. And it's quite important research because it has pretty consistently since then informed government policy. So it informed a lot of the work done by the previous Labour government around Every Child a Talker and programmes in terms of that. But it's also continued to inform research today and government policy today. And we're going to have a look at why and what that might look like. But we know that when children, so the children from the poorest communities start school 19 months behind their more affluent peers. And that was actually some evidence from pre-COVID, so it might be more dramatic in terms of that now. And we know that 1 in 4 children, so 23% of children who struggle with language at the age of 5, so who aren't meeting the early learning goal, then don't go on to meet the expected standards at the end of Key Stage 2. So they don't meet the expected level in English at the end of Key Stage 2. And we also know that if we're then thinking that, if they're struggling at the age of 5, a substantial number of them then aren't meeting the expected level at the end of Year 6. But only 11% of children who don't reach the expected standard in English at the end of Year 6 go on to get a GCSE in English or in maths. It's the same as part of that. So what we know is that children with poor vocabulary at aged 5 are already more than twice as likely to be unemployed at the age of 34. So we know there's a real importance in a really, really strong start for children. And it's really important they have a strong start in their home, with their families and with their carers, but it's also important that they have a really, really strong start in schools. And we know that in England, we're facing a huge language and literacy challenge. And that if we think about the last set of Key Stage 2 test results before the pandemic, it said that disadvantaged children, 40% of disadvantaged children weren't meeting the expected level in reading. So we know that children from disadvantaged backgrounds are likely to be, it doesn't mean they all are, it means they're statistically likely to be more impacted by less exposure to vocabulary and less exposure to ambitious vocabulary. So what we need to think about in terms of practitioners is being really clear that we know the starting points of where our children come in, and we have to think about how are we going to take the child from their starting point and try to rapidly accelerate their exposure, their knowledge and their understanding of language and vocabulary. And it's about thinking about how can we make learning memorable so that children are learning and remembering more. We've got another slide that talks about just a little bit more about the impact on disadvantaged children. And it's not something that's new. And what it talks about is that once children start school and they're at the age of 5, good readers improve at a faster pace than poor readers as part of that. So how can we address that? So this is a really important quote and something that I want you to remember. It's taken from the DfE reading framework. The DfE reading framework really starts in reception and now goes up all the way into Key Stage 2. It does have some interesting things to read if you haven't read it and you're an early years practitioner, but it really is starting at that point. It does have a few things about what comes before, but it's primarily based on that and now going up into Key Stage 2 and actually into secondary as part of that. So it says really clearly, a language-rich environment is one in which adults talk with children throughout the day. The more children take part in conversations, the more they will understand once they can read, and the more vocabulary and ideas they will have to draw on when they can write. So if we think about that, that's a really clear statement within that. And I think as we go forward, we're going to see a similar statement from Ofsted in terms of inspections, early years inspections in schools and settings, which says the same. It talks about a language-rich environment not being one with post-its and labels stuck up that children can't read, but being a really language-rich environment is one in which adults talk to children throughout the day. And I spend quite a lot of time in school and school nursery, school nursery and reception classes when they're being Ofsted inspected. And it's not unusual for the inspector to say on the second day, and on the second morning, I'm going back into early years, and my focus is going to be on adult interactions and how much the adults are talking to children. So we know that in order to become a fluent and skilled reader, it starts before children start school, and it starts before children encounter a book for the first time, and it starts right back looking at that video of that grandma with that baby, but it starts right from then about how we engage with children from the very earliest stage. And language comprehension that we need for both reading and writing starts from birth, and it develops when adults talk to children about the world around them, and they help children to put those experiences and that language into context. So what we have to think about is that children will enter our setting or our school with different experiences. And those different experiences will include their exposure to English, their exposure to language, their exposure to vocabulary. And they will also have had different experiences. And through those different experiences, they will have had exposure to different language as part of that. So we know that some children will have had more exposure and some will have had less. So what we need to think about is how, as practitioners, do we ensure that our early years curriculum takes those children from the point at which they are when they enter and helps to make up for some of those weaknesses that children may have in terms of their language acquisition on entry. And I think that we're in a really different world from how far how we were even 20 years ago. I think it was 2008 when Apple's iPhone was launched, maybe 2009, somewhere around there. And before that, we had the internet in our houses, some people, not everybody at that point, but we've moved to a world now where we carry technology around in our pocket. And if you sit and you look at adults sitting in Starbucks, on a bus, on a train, eating a meal with friends, wherever they are, adults will be looking, most adults, not all, but they will be looking at their phone all the time, and they'll be getting information and text through their phone. And if we think about that, it's not unusual. I spend a lot of time traveling on public transport, and I think it's not unusual to see adults who will be sitting there flicking on their phone and looking at their phone and not engaging with their children. So I think there's so many more distractions for us as adults throughout the day because we have our phones with us and we have all of that information sort of there at our fingertips. So I don't just think that it's about personally, this is my personal view, I don't just think it's about the exposure to language in the home. I think it's that we're living our lives in different ways. And so I think that maybe it's becoming more acceptable not to talk to people when you're sitting with them as part of that. And we see that translate into children. And I just left a school at lunchtime back in September, and some of the nursery children came out with their parents, and one of them happened to get on the same bus behind me, and there was some reason we were stuck on that bus for quite a long time, for 40 minutes, and the adult with that child did not engage or talk to that child for 40 minutes. And that child was desperately trying to get the attention of the adults who were around them, because children want to engage and they want to chat. And the adults sat there looking at their phone and looking at their own thing. And I don't think that's at all unusual. And we're going to look at how we encourage parents, how we do that ourselves, and how we encourage parents to talk more to their children. because language is necessary if we want children to access our curriculum. So as we move forward through early years, we will have our planned and purposeful curriculum. And when I always talk about it as we need to think really carefully about the knowledge, the skills and the vocabulary that we want children to learn. And we could argue that vocabulary is a knowledge, and I'm sure it is really, but actually if we don't think explicitly about vocabulary, there's a risk that it drops off. So we're going to look at some examples of that as we go through. But it's really important that children's language skills are developed. You might have seen this before. This is called Dr. Scarborough's reading rope. And so it looks at the skills that if we're going to go through to be a skilled reader, we need both language comprehension and word recognition. And so language comprehension, which is necessary for both reading and writing, starts from birth. It only develops when adults talk with children about the world around them. That might be through books, through stories, fiction and non-fiction. They read with them, they share rhymes, poems and songs together. And the second part of it, which is the skilled word reading, is something that starts later. And that includes being able to quickly work out the pronunciation of unfamiliar words, decoding, recognizing words, and then they go on to writing, which is about transcription, spelling and handwriting, and composition, articulating ideas and structuring them before writing. So it's really important, and I think what this shows is the real importance of the range of oral language knowledge and the processes that children need to be skilled readers and then ultimately to move on to be skilled writers. So if we're looking at the language comprehension, children need to have that background knowledge. They need to have the vocabulary and they need to have that breadth of vocabulary, and they need to be able to make links. They need to understand language and how it fits together. So they need to be able to understand sentence structures. They need to be able to understand expression as well as part of that. And they need to they need to be able to develop verbal reasoning and inference, and they need to be able to have that literacy knowledge and understand print concepts, and starting with that print carries meaning. And then, and it's really clear again that the formal teaching of phonics wouldn't start until children, there wouldn't be an expectation that the formal teaching of phonics would start until children were in reception classes. And at that point, they're then starting to develop that awareness of phonics. So a really important thing is that the key to addressing that vocabulary gap is constant quality conversation. And we've got to make up for that lack of words that some children may be experiencing. And all talk that children are exposed to is useful, but it's particularly useful when it's directed to the child specifically. And when children expand their language and vocabulary, when they can listen or join in, when they have those opportunities for those conversations. And we know that children talk more when they're in one-to-one situations or smaller groups, and they tend to talk less as the group becomes bigger and the quality of the interactions drops off as the group becomes bigger. So that's something to think of as well, about how do we make sure that we enable children to have quality time, quality one-to-one time, or quality time in small groups to enable children to be able to talk. This is taken from Every Child a Talker. It was a government programme that ran until about 2011. You can still find quite a lot of the resources, well, all of them, I think, online, and they're actually really useful. And it talks about thinking about where children are in terms of their communication journey. So if we're thinking about early communication, that's children whose communication needs to be interpreted by adults. So a baby crying. And then we start to see, and we're going to definitely see this in some of the videos we look at, because we're looking across a whole range in terms of this, but we start to see children using gestures and some words, and often that relates very much to their own experience and themselves at that point. And then we see children moving through to start to communicate, but they find sentences difficult. So they move from single words to 2 or 3 words and into sentences, and we need to develop and encourage that. And some of the sounds in some of the words are harder for them to pronounce as well. And then we get children who start to use simple sentences to communicate, and they start to ask questions and explore to find out more. And as we go through some of the videos, we're going to see some nice examples of some of those. And they talk about a skilled communicator being a child who communicates in the way that you'd expect for their age. So using words and using sentences and telling stories at an age appropriate. And then the consideration of children, for children as English as an additional language learners. So children who can communicate really effectively in their home language, but haven't yet learnt to do so in English. And you can see, if you watch those children in a classroom or a setting, you can see them translating in their heads. And I was out doing some Key Stage 2 SATs moderation last week in a school that has high numbers of new arrivals. And you could see some of the children sort of saying the words, almost their lips moving as they were saying the words, translating it back into their home language and then translating it back into English, because they weren't yet at that point where it was automatic in terms of what they do. And then I'm sure you can all think about those children who need lots of encouragement to communicate. So they have the skills and the knowledge and they have the vocabulary, but they can be really reluctant in terms of that. So I think that one of the things that it suggests that you do is you can think about your children in terms of these headings, and it can help you think about which children might need more support in terms of their speech and language, and thinking about what's in place for those children. And if we we're just going to go on to have a look at this one. This was a report that was published just before the pandemic, not long before the pandemic. And it was published by the National Literacy Trust, but it had parliamentary support in terms of it being published. And not long after it was published, we sort of moved into the pandemic, but it was a very influential text, and you can have a look at it. And the reason I first became aware of it was during the first lockdown. I was on Ofsted were running, one of the literacy English HMIs was running a training session for some local authority, very small group of local authority advisors, and I was on that course, and she actually flagged up this text and so it talked about how what is in this has influenced, it's definitely influenced the 2021 EYFS, because you can see a lot of similar. It's influenced the Ofsted inspection framework, and it's also influenced the DFE guidance on the teaching of reading. So it's a really influential text as part of that. And it goes through and it looks and it says that if we're looking at how we support language learning, that what we need to make sure is that there's a structured, targeted and explicit approach to language learning. It doesn't just happen in settings. We need to make sure it happens. And I talk a lot about this. It's not just about, as other research said in terms of that, Serge Blatchford's research, it's not just about creating this amazing environment and expecting children to learn. Adults need to explicitly teach children, and they need to explicitly teach children in the areas of provision, but they also need to explicitly teach children to address the gaps in their language and in their skills and in their knowledge. And it looks at 6 areas, and that's what we're going to go through broadly and look at as part of this. So it talks about the importance of high quality interaction, conversational turn taking, actively teaching listening, actively teaching vocabulary to children, about dialogic reading, and about shared narrative. And if we want to unlock early language and reading for every child, it says that this is what we need to have in place in terms of our approach within our school or within our setting. And we know it's really, really important, the experience that children have had preschool, and children who are read to at home mimic reading behaviours. The age that parents, how early with a baby parents establish routine makes a difference to the reading habits of children, and that parents are really strongly children are really strongly influenced by their parents' attitude to reading. And more than that, children are really strongly influenced by their parents' approach to talking to them when they're very young. And there's something called contingent talk. So it's a style of communication where the parent talks to the child about the objects within their current area of focus, so things that they can see and what's going on around them. And they found that babies and toddlers whose parents frequently used contingent talk, so they talk to their children when they're out and about what the child's seeing, what's the child's experience, they're using the language in terms of that, go on to have a much greater vocabulary when they're toddlers, which carries on forward when they become older children as well. And it suggests that one of the most successful strategies to use as parents is to develop that contingent talk, so that talking to children as we go through. And I heard a phrase long ago, and I had to go and look it up. And I was in a supermarket, and there was a really young child, about 6 months old, and it was with a parent. And the parent they were in front of the grocery, the green veg department, and the parent was picking up the vegetables and they were showing them to the child, and they were telling the child the name of the kale and the cabbage and the cauliflower and the carrots. And they were showing it to the child, and the child was holding it, and they were talking about, do we want it for our tea and this, that. And I heard someone next to me went, performance parenting. And I thought, I don't know what performance parenting is. So I went and I Googled it, and it talked about performance parenting being a phrase where it talked about where parents need to be openly seen to have some perfection in terms of their parenting. And I was thinking, but it's not performance parenting, it's contingent talk. And I think that it's really important that we make sure that we talk to children, even when, well, we saw the baby responding, didn't we? But even when children can't respond to language. So I know that when I had my own children, was really young, you feel a little bit like an idiot walking around everywhere you're going, talking to the children at a point at which they can't respond. But it's really, really important that we do talk to children, and that contingent talk, and that parents talk about those objects and they give a context to what is happening for children, because that's vital in terms of that language development. So one of the things that report talks about at the moment is about the real importance of focus from the start and targeted support. And it gives a couple of examples of a couple of projects, and one of them is in fact Nellie. And when I wrote this presentation, I didn't know that we were going to have someone to come and talk about Nellie. So if you can stay on to learn about Nellie, then please do. I've got lots of schools and settings who've done the Nellie program and other bits and pieces of that, and they say it not only helps in terms of those individual children who the program focuses on, but it really helps in upskilling wider staff within the school or the setting as part of that. So the examples in the case studies in that one, two of them really, Talk Boost and Nellie are two of them in terms of that. So we need to think about how we support children to catch up. And it's really important that we're developing their vocabulary, we're developing their critical thinking skills, and that we're developing them at the same time. And one of the questions that I always ask is, have we really identified those children who might need to receive some targeted support right from the beginning? And there's a thinking in terms of how we support children of all ages, but this idea that we can put in universal strategies and universal support that will really help some children, but it won't harm any. And an example that I was thinking about from that, I'm advisor to a school nursery. It's a big school. It has a 90-form entry, but the nursery is actually really small. And because of the needs of the parents in that particular community, the children who access the nursery don't necessarily go on to access the school, because a lot of those parents need longer hours or full daycare. So as a result, the school has a lot of children with English as an additional language, but as a result, the nursery has a majority of children with English as an additional language. And they include children at different stages of learning English. And a lot of the families live in multi-generational families. So one of the things that they found is that whilst mum and dad might have been UK educated, Often the children were spending a lot of time with grannies or aunties who spoke to them more in their first and their home language. And they had a big reflection on their practice, because what they discovered was that what they were doing is the children were starting, they were doing a few assessments, they were letting the children settle, they were getting them to know them really well. And then after 6 or 8 weeks, they were assessing where the children are, and they were finding that the children, but particularly the children with English as an additional language, but some who weren't, who didn't have English as an additional language, were actually behind their peers and behind where they'd expect in terms of their language development. And when they reflected on that, they said, well, they knew that at the beginning, although some of the children were a bit shy and a bit less confident, and they didn't want to jump to conclusions in terms of that. So what they decided was that they were going to try putting in some of the support that they'd done as a universal program rather than as a targeted one. So what they used, they followed something called Teddy Talk. It's not a program recommended in this book. If you have a Google of it, I think it was developed in Scotland. And it's a specific program for EAL learners. But what they'd have done before is they'd have had all the children in, they'd have assessed them at a certain period, they would have identified that some needed additional support, they'd have put that additional support in place. Some of them would have caught up, some of them would still be needing to catch up, and by then it would be the end of the first term. So what they decided was that they would look at that Teddy Talk approach for all children. They knew that it really supported children with EAL, but they wanted it to support all children. So it looks at, it's short sessions, I'd say 10 to 15 minutes, 3 times a week in small groups. So, and it looks at good sitting, good listening, good looking. It has songs, it introduces vocabulary, and you can adapt it to the vocabulary that you particularly want to introduce. So they introduced it for all children. They found that actually it had some really positive benefits, not just in language, but around opportunities for practitioners to get to know children better. It's a very fun session if you see it being run. But also it was helping in terms of listening behaviours, even for children who didn't have English as an additional language. And then they found that they started at the beginning. When they assessed those children at the end of 8 weeks, of sort of running their programme, they found that far fewer of them needed any kind of additional language support, because they'd really helped them to catch up on that key vocabulary. So they'd taken something that was additionally usually used as a targeted program, and they'd put it in place right from the beginning for all children, because they'd found it actually benefited all. So I think it's about thinking about some approaches like Nellie are very closely targeted, but some of the strategies that you might use to support children as a catch-up will actually work really well with all children as part of that. So thinking about those children and thinking about that idea about how can we catch up children from the start, because whether children start with you when they're 6 months old or 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or older, how quickly can we start to close that language gap? Because we know that by the time they're 2.5, that language gap is already really starting to open. So how can we jump in at that point and try and target and address that? So we're going to move on to the next bit, looking at high quality interactions. We actually did a session about this earlier in this series. It is recorded and it is available if you'd want it. So we're going to look at this part more briefly as part of that. But if you want to have access of that, it's on the YouTube channel and you can have a look at it. So it's really important that we look at high quality interactions. So we're going to, and the reason that high quality interactions are so important is that high quality interactions between adults, whether they're parents, carers, or teachers, and young children, are those valuable opportunities to support and access that language development. So in this same guidance that we've talked about, this report I've told you, it talks about that importance of contingent talk. So where the adult is talking about what the child is doing, they're commenting on it, they're questioning, they're providing a narrative for what the children are doing, they're expanding, they're repeating it back to the children or recasting it back. So where the phrase might be repeated back, or it might be slightly extended, or one word might be added as part of that, or you might repeat it back with the correct grammar. And where those really engaging high quality interactions are in place, when those practitioners are really highly tuned into the children's capability, it not only develops their language skills, but it also nurtures their confidence and their engagement and that positive praise and that positive affirmation. And it talked about the real importance of noticing what a child is interested in and talking to them about it. And particularly with younger children, they're still at that point where they're very, very focused on themselves and their world and what's important to them. And if we think about how we interact with children as part of that, and going back to what I said about that importance, about thinking about, do we make sure that we have opportunities to talk to all children on a one-to-one basis? So we're not just talking to children in groups, but we're spending quality time talking to those children in one-to-one sessions, or in small group sessions of 2 or 3. So all talk's useful for children, but it's really about making sure that that's a priority. And it's that, what's my role as a practitioner in the setting, and really saying, actually, one of the really key parts of your role is to talk to children, and to develop their language and to develop their vocabulary as part of that. So we talked about some of this in the last one, so I don't want to go on repeat this, but just to flag it up if you haven't seen it, or to remind you a little bit about it. So it's how we manage to take children's speech into their language, into their comprehension. So really important things that we do when we're working with children. So showing that we're interested. We know that we saw in that baby video, didn't we, children communicating from the very first day in which they're born as part of that. And so showing an interest in them, getting down to their level, about commenting, as I just said, about what they're talking about not overcorrecting children. That can really put children off. So just repeating it back with a word added or that grammar corrected as part of that. About that associating a word with an object. So about if children can see pictures or objects or films, ideally objects, have children totally amazed by the size of a badger in real life, because I think they presumed badgers were the size of bears from seeing them in books as part of that. But learning to associate that word with an object. And then there's a skill of keyword holding. So you're using the language that the child might know, so the dog and the table, to expand and develop their vocabulary as part of that. And about really thinking about that one-to-one time. Can you give children 5 minutes of one-to-one time 2 or 3 times a week in terms of developing it? And then I know before we shared the EF Shrek model, and I just put that there as a prompt as part of that. But it's really, really important that children have as many interactions with adults as they can. And then as they become older, they'll start to have those valuable interactions with their peers and with other children as well. So we're going to have a look at another video.
Ava's had a lot of experiences with books. She's often seen Mum reading, and they've enjoyed reading stories together. When she chooses to read a book, she knows where to start reading and in which direction to turn the pages. And importantly, she knows that books tell stories.
Longwood, Tay, Cat, listed on there, a cat listed on there, a cat listed on there, and a mummy cat listed on the front. The A for tat.
As children's brains develop, their memory recall becomes faster and more efficient, making it easier to remember stories and retell recent events. These are often children's first reasons for wanting to write something down. To do this, they need to be able to organise their thoughts, and being confident to talk out loud helps them as they begin to tell personal stories. Listening and telling are integral to reading and writing.
I want settee.
Are you? What have you been doing on the settee?
Ava tells Mum what's happening to Frog in her imaginative game.
Oh, that's nice.
It's a little one.
Just a little one.
Yeah.
Is Frog feeling okay?
Yeah.
Yeah.
He's fell over.
Did he?
Yeah.
Oh dear, where did he fall?
A floor. I sat on again.
How did he fall on the floor? What happened?
I saw put him on a settee and I will fall.
That's a good idea.
And they're okay.
Good. They look very happy.
They're very happy.
Have they been having a good time?
Oh,
Mwah.
here's the for the teeth.
Oh, I'd love to give Frog a kiss. Mwah.
Seb is trying hard to express his thoughts and feelings.
Pirate.
You're a pirate today, aren't you?
Yes. Where my eye keeper?
Where's your eye keeper?
Yeah,
Your eye patch? I
yeah.
don't know what happened to that. So I think we lost it. Didn't we?
Where?
I can't remember. I think when we got on the bus, when you just bought it, we lost it then.
When Michael came round.
Yeah, when Michael came on, so he bought you it, didn't he?
Why?
Is that a present?
Did I hold it? Did I have my hook on?
You did. You had your hook and your sword.
He succeeds because he has Mum helping him describe what is quite a complex sequence of events.
Playing with the sword. Yeah, and then can't have my sword.
Jamie, why can't Jamie have it?
Because I want to have it. And Captain Hook didn't have a sword.
Oh, he just has a hook, doesn't he? I think he maybe has a sword as well.
Yeah. It's Captain Hook.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
That's the best pirate on the 7 seas, Deb.
Where's my
As they become good talkers and listeners, children become able to have proper, if simple, conversations with their peers.
by the head? Who's eating it? See? About the look. Yeah, that's my brother. Mister. You hooked it on the picture. Yeah, I hooked it on job. And I banged it. And I got it and then I banged it on there. Yeah.
Towards the end of the 3rd year, friends are becoming increasingly important as they begin to learn more and more from each other.
Oh, no.
Even at this young age, children are now acquiring a broad use of language, becoming very familiar with its sounds and often becoming keen talkers, able to put their thoughts into words. They're enthusiastic about making marks, the precursor of emergent writing, and are becoming familiar with the uses of print. With an early love of books, they're even beginning to look a bit like readers.
So one of the things that we saw in that video, we saw the importance of the conversation and the high quality adult conversation. We saw the children starting to become storytellers. We saw them starting to talk in sentences. We saw adults remodeling and recasting that language back. The little boy in The Pirate, for example, shared experiences, retelling something that he remembered in terms of that. But what we also saw in that was one of the next things that it talks about as being important in a structured, targeted and explicit approach, conversational turn taking. So there was a recent study in 2018 which talked about the value of conversational turn taking and how it supported brain development in young children. So they looked at home language experience of children from 4 to 6, and they found that children from all social and economic backgrounds who experienced a higher level of conversational turns per hour had increased verbal language scores, and that remained significant, even allowing for differences in the amount of words that they heard. So what it talked about is that Frequent conversational turn taking enables children to practice language and to gain feedback from adults, and it also allows adults to adjust how they're talking to children as part of that, in order to be able to support those children. So to address the complexity and adjust of how they talk to children. And again, we looked at this as part of the adult interactions, and I don't want to dwell on it too much, but it's how we manage to get that back and forward conversation in place. So that idea of the number and the quality of conversations matter. So can we aim for at least 4 turns when we're looking at getting that that dialogue in place with children? So through rephrasing and extending, through asking open and closed questions, and through modelling examples, but helping children to articulate their ideas and to put them into well-formed sentences. So if you want more information about that, there's a lot more in the previous presentation. So we're going to look at the next one, which is about teaching listening. And it talked about that if we want to develop language skills and vocabulary skills in children, we need to be able to teach children to listen. And listening is a vital component, which that particular research says is too often overlooked. And it talked about how we need to have listening activities built into what we're doing in early year settings or in school classrooms. And that can actually be giving a child a role of, you're the listener in terms of this. Tell me what you've, more for older children who have more language, but tell me what you've heard, summarize and repeat it. And we know that when we support children with developing their listening skills, it supports them with their later development of their phonics as well. So we're going to have a look at a brief video for that one.
Use our listening ears and see if we can find out what's making that sound. Are we ready? Are you ready to listen? Ready? Listening, waiting. What was that? Well done, Jack. Right, what's next? What's making that sound, Tiger? Tiger, what's making that sound? Can we look at the pictures, Tiger? What's making that sound? What's making that sound? That's a phone, yes. But what was making the sound? What do you think it was, Heidi? I'm not sure if it was the phone. I think it might have been this, the guitar. Yeah. Well, it's a box, isn't it? I can't see it. It was, well, I think you might just hear that sound tonight, because it's these here. Do you know what they're called? Fireworks. Fireworks, yes. So you might have seen some of those. It's firework night. Daddy had some fireworks, did you?
Yes.
Did you have them in your garden?
Yeah.
How exciting.
Daddy fire.
I think it was someone playing a musical instrument. Playing the, what's it called? The piano. Oh, that's right. Good talking, Jack. The piano. Are we ready for the next sound? It is, isn't it? Well done. It's a quacking duck. Pardon? Is she crying? Oh, she doesn't look very happy, does she? What's next? It's a cat. That's right. Where's the cat? There's the cat. It's a lovely black and white cat, isn't it? Oh, it's a phone, isn't it? Yes. Oh, yes, and we've got a phone up there as well, Tiger Lily, haven't we? But ours makes a different sound, doesn't it? Ah. What's that? I don't think it was the duck. It sounded like a bzzz. Who's making a bzzz? Who do you think it was? I think it's something on this page. What is it? What is it? Oh, it lives in a beehive. Yes, you're right, Jack. It's a bee. Buzzy, buzzy bee. I wonder what sounds next. Are we ready with our listening ears?
So if we think about that one, what I liked the use of the photographs. I liked that they were developing their listening skills, but also their vocabulary. I did particularly like the way she turned the board round so he could see the photos and he wasn't looking at them upside down in terms of that. But it's really important that we develop children's listening skills and that sound discrimination. And I think one of the things I think about when we're teaching listening is to be really clear, what does good listening look like? And so that everybody has the same expectation for how children will listen and what listening looks like. I think I've put a placement carpet on here, which isn't really about a placement carpet, but that's idea about, do we think about how we sit with children? So do we use with small groups of children, a semicircle or a circle where they can see each other? They can see each other's mouths when they talk. They can see each other's lips move and hear all the children. Or a semicircle where they can all focus in on the adults as part of that. Do we have a particular signal for attention? A lot of schools and settings that I use will just play one musical note. And at that point, the children will know that it's time to be quiet as that. So I think it's about thinking about, okay, we focus a lot on our speaking and on our honesty, but what do we do and what do we want from how children might be taught to become good listeners as part of that? And just going on about a few more strategies to support talk, probably more appropriate with older children, but about thinking about having a no hands up, so a cold calling strategies or approaches as terms of that. So we don't just ask the children who've got their hands up. And in fact, if we have it embedded from the beginning, children never put their hands up. They know they're going to be asked. And one of the advantages of asking children questions with no hands up is we can target a question. So we can ask a question that's relevant to the exact level that child is working at, rather than asking a general question, which most of the children you'd expect will be able to answer, but for some that question will be too hard, and for some that question will be too easy. So a real advantage about having a no hands up, about teaching children those routines of back and forth, about thinking about talk partners. See a lot of talk partners in schools particularly, and obviously children need to be at the point where they can hold those conversations, but when it works well, it is totally embedded into the routines of the classroom, and children have been taught right from the beginning. There's an academy trust in the north called Dixon's, and their teaching videos are on YouTube if you want to have a look. And you can have a look at that. And one of those, I think, is about talk partners. And if you look, and you can see all the way from the very youngest children right up to their sixth form children, I think, young people in terms of that. But how do we teach children to turn to their partners when they're young, to develop that idea one person speaks, building up on what they say, and then getting to the point where they can sit and have that conversation side by side. So they need to be taught how to talk. If they're going to use talk partners, you need to teach them how to do it. It doesn't just happen. Adults need to model the conversation. It could be two adults in the classroom modeling the conversation so that the children then know how to take that conversation into their own. But too often when you see talk partners used, particularly with younger children, either the children aren't talking or they don't know what to say, or they're talking about something that's not relevant. And when we're thinking about talk partners, do we sometimes put two noisy children together, sometimes put two quiet children, might sometimes put a child with a really effective vocabulary with one who hasn't got such an effective vocabulary, but also that child with an effective vocabulary needs to be with another child with that stimulating vocabulary at some point as well. So really using it carefully. And about just thinking about how we really encourage children to talk and to get as much child talk as we can running throughout our day. Just a little plug here for phase 1 phonics, which I've called the forgotten phase. Actually, it's come back a little bit this year, but the activity that we saw with the listening was actually very much a phase 1 phonics activity. So very clear again, there's no expectation that children are going to be formally taught phonics before reception, but what we need to do is teach that listening, teach them that sound discrimination. So because if they can't discriminate those sounds, that environmental, those sounds, body percussion, and if they can't do that, then when we get to the point where we're starting to teach them phonics and we're getting to the point at which they're orally blending and segmenting, and they're starting at that point to link those sounds that they're hearing to those representation of letters, then at that point children are not going to be able to move forward with their phonics. And I've been working with quite a lot of schools this year who've taken a slightly different approach to that. So one of the things that they did when they did their baseline assessment to reception is they identified some children who they knew their listening skills weren't as strong, their language skills weren't as strong as part of that. So those children have absolutely accessed phonics through whole class teaching with the rest of the class. So they've absolutely followed whichever program they're doing, if it's Little Wandle, Read, Write, Ink, one of the others as part of that. So from the beginning in reception, they started phonics promptly, as the current guidance said, and they have been taught alongside their peers. But at the same time, those settings, those reception classes have put in an intervention, if you want, about going back and doing phase 1 phonics with those children, and not just doing the practicing the oral blending part, because for some children they needed to go back and do the kind of activity that we've just seen about being able to do that that sound discrimination and hearing those sounds. Because what those schools had found before is that they will do their first half-term teaching of phonics, they will assess the children at that point, and some of those children at that point, they won't be able, they will really struggle with getting to the point at which they're having to build those words because they can't do that oral blending and segmenting. And so they're putting in that intervention early alongside the main teaching of that phonics to make sure that those children are caught up from the beginning. Going to look a little bit about planning for vocabulary. Alex Quigley wrote a book called Closing the Vocabulary Gap in 2018, used by lots of schools and lots of academy trusts to inform their literacy strategies. I would say it's not an early years book, so I'm not suggesting you out and back, but it's interesting in terms of that. And he talks about how we have to have 3 pillars of vocabulary teaching. We have to explicitly teach vocabulary to children. There's incidental vocabulary learning, and then there's that cultivating that word consciousness and developing children's understanding of that. And we need to do all 3 of those in early years. And we need to have planned, purposeful and explicit vocabulary teaching. And so adults introduce new words to children all of the time, and we need to encourage children to use them. And I was in a school last week, and they have very, very big oracy focused school. and around their walls in reception, they have they're a little Wandle school as well, but they have an alphabet, and the children collect interesting words, and they're up there. And they're not words the children can read yet because of their phonics, but they're words that they want to cultivate. They're words that they've generally come across in stories that are more unusual words, but they're words that they want the children to learn. And so they're up there, I suppose, as much of a prompt for the adults, so because but to get them, so the children, they've heard those words once, they're really interesting words, but if we just hear words, we're going to forget them. But they collect those words and they keep on using those words with the children. There's not a vast number of them, because if you get to a vast number, it gets so that you can't do it as part of that. So we're going to go and have a look at a video about why don't cows live in water, about developing it. But I've also put in a picture here about, and going back to those photographs that the children were looking at, all cats aren't black and white, all rabbits aren't brown in terms of that. An apple might be red, it might be green, it might be the apple symbol on a computer. Children need to see lots of different images, not just one image of something. And me personally, I prefer photographs. I think photographs are more powerful than drawing or images or clip art type images. That's my view. And these are some of my cows. And a cow isn't just a black and white. A cow is there's a Highland cow at the back, a Texas Longhorn, a Friesian, a Holstein as part of that. And we need to use that vocabulary with children. We need to use that technical vocabulary with them as well.
So it could be, does the princess go on a boat?
Yeah.
Oh, there's a big boat.
An old boat.
An old boat. Good boy.
Big boat.
And what's that on this picture? Where are the ducks? Oh, they're in the water. I couldn't see them. Clever boy. Did you know they were there?
They're hiding.
They're hiding. Are they underneath? Oh, yeah. Are they underneath the water? What else lives in this picture?
Sheep.
Sheep. Where are the sheep? Are they over the hill? Oh, how clever.
Yeah, they're hiding.
They're hiding. Did they not want their photograph taken?
No. Don't like it.
They don't like it. Maybe the flash would scare them of the camera. The flash. Because sometimes when you take a photograph, it makes a flash of light. Perhaps they don't like it, and that's why they're hiding.
Don't like it.
Thanks, Brian.
Is it toy?
She's just coming straight back. She's just going to give her mummy a kiss. So who could walk down this little path?
Me?
You. Would you like to go there?
Yeah.
Would you? Does it look like a happy place?
Yeah. I'm going there. I was just see it down there.
You would go and find a sheep.
Yeah.
Would you? You would go and find a horse.
I'll find a sheep.
And what will you do when you find them?
Let's see if in the house. I'll find the little sheep in there.
You'll find a little sheep in there.
There's a tree.
Hiding behind a tree. And what will you do with the sheep when you say hello? I found you. I found you. Oh, you found a pig. Where does the pig live in the picture? Oh, he lives there. Oh, I see. Does he have any pig friends?
Yeah.
Yes. Where do they live? In a house. What else is in the picture, Jack?
Cow.
Oh, the cow. And we said the cows might live in the trees. And the horse, where does the horse live in our picture? Down there at the bottom. Does he have a stable to sleep in? That's the noise the cows make, isn't it? There's a farmer. Where does the farmer live?
Up there.
Up there. Does he live on the other side of the hill?
Yeah.
Ducks. Oh, you said there were ducks. Didn't you see them? And where do they go?
In the water.
In that water.
Yeah, they're hiding. It's scared.
They're scared. So they live in the water. Why do the cows live in the water? They're not dirty.
So by the time children are 4.5, the amount of decontextualized talk, so explanation, talk about pretend story and narrative that a child's exposed to are the strongest predictors of their current vocabulary. And there's some research from speech and language therapists called Parson and Brannigan, whose books recommend the teaching of what they call Goldilocks words. So what they say is identifying words that are not too easy or too hard, but are just about right for the child. So they should have have some use beyond the immediate topic, but they should link to the children's understanding. And what we saw in that video was some of the we saw her extending some of the vocabulary use of the children and introducing words like stable, but she wasn't taking the children beyond language that they could access as part of that. So when we're thinking about vocabulary, we need to have the explicit teaching of vocabulary. So going back to that idea, it doesn't just happen. And I don't know, you might be familiar with this, but this is old research which has come very much back to the front now, but it talks about children needing to have tier 1, tier 2 and tier 3 vocabulary. So tier 1 vocabulary is everyday words familiar to conversation. And I always taught them about being functional words that children might need to have and be able to use. So yellow and car as part of that. And some children will be at the age where they need to develop that functional vocabulary. But what we really need to try and teach and develop through our language with children is tier 2 words. So they are high frequency words, so words that are used a lot in the English language, but they might, and they're found across different areas within that, and they might encounter them in different contexts. Now, whenever you start reading about this, there's quite a lot of debate about what's a tier 1 or a tier 2 word in terms of that. But we're thinking about supporting children to understand that words can have different meanings in different contexts. So drive would be a word that would have, so it might be driving in my car, but I would have a drive or a driveway on which I could park my car. So there are lots and lots of words in the English language which have a different meaning depending on the context that they're in. And so we need to be able to nurture and develop that with children and support them to use those words. And as part of that, we need to be able to engage in conversation that goes just beyond the functional. So for some children, when they come in, there has to be a really strong focus on that functional vocabulary, the words that they need in order to be able to manage in the school setting. But then we need to start to think about how can we develop some of that tier 2 vocabulary. And then the tier 3 vocabulary is vocabulary that has a very specific context. So estuary would be an example of that. It generally has one meaning. So we're just going to go on and have a look at this video.
Get them a little book then to look at.
What children need over early childhood is plenty of what you might say first-hand experiences. They need time, they need space, they need flexible resources, often very simple, and they need to be just allowed to organise their own play.
He pretends to read a story to get the fireman to sleep. Pretend play is also invaluable in the way it encourages and advances his language.
Oh no.
It's a big fat dog, isn't it?
Huge. Huge.
Huge.
Huge. And stuff.
Is he soft? Oh,
Talks about what he's doing using longer sentences and descriptive words.
think he's going for a walk, maybe.
Yeah. There's some dog with Mama, Ma. I say, please, Ma. Ich bin so. Yeah. Right, Ma, it's waking.
Is he walking up?
Because they are relaxed, that's where they will happily use their language. They will then weave in their pretending to read, their pretend writing, all those things through having enough time to let their play develop, and that we are close by. We're a playful companion. We join in sometimes. We follow their orders in play, and we don't take over the play.
Finished. It's finished. It's finished.
He's finished. Let's have a look at the fireman.
It's finished.
Did you like your story?
As well as allowing the space and time for children to organise their own play, they also need time to experience their environment and find out more about what interests them.
Flying awesome spider.
Find Orson Spider. Can you see him there? You want to have a look at him?
Yeah?
You want to have a look at him?
Yeah.
Yeah? Can you pick him up? The snail's always full of water.
It's full of water.
Yeah. So where he's completely gone. Do you want to have a hold?
Yeah.
He's in a spiral, isn't
Please. It's dead.
he? He is dead. Do you think we can find some live things?
Yeah.
What live things? We need spiders and snails. Spiders and snails.
It's spider.
Oh, you've got a spider as well? Look, there's a tiny spider.
Wow.
Should we put him back nice and safe?
Yeah.
Yeah? 1, 2, 3, blow. 1, 2, 3. There he goes.
On the conker.
Yes, you buried the conker.
Yeah.
Yeah?
On the conker.
You never guess what Daddy's found on there as well. Yeah. Slimy slug.
Flying slug.
Slimy slug.
Flying slug.
He's engaged, listening carefully to Dad, soaking up new words and information.
Right.
So we saw in terms of that some contingent talk. We also saw some of the developing as a vocabulary, and we saw them talk about spirals as well as part of that. I've put the next screen up. So when the DfE published its first version of its reading framework and guidance, this was the examples of the vocabulary being proposed around a reception visit from firefighters as part of that. So it suggested that, it says very strongly that we need to plan for vocabulary. And these are the examples of the kind of questions it said that we would talk about to children afterwards to try and recount their experiences. And it is really important that we talk to children about experiences that have happened as part of that. But when we look at some of the examples of the language that are in there, you know, we're talking about extinguish and dangerous and fire resistant and some very specific, so thermal imaging camera, which would be tier 3 vocabulary because it has a very specific meaning as part of that. Speedy thinking, daring and heroic. And I think it's fair to say that when most people saw this, they took a deep intake of breath and it made them think really carefully about the vocabulary that we need to use with children. And when we're thinking about part of our curriculum, whether it's a focus we've got or whether it's a visit or an event, do we think really carefully about the language that we want to use with children? So we need to introduce that language and we need to use it with children, and we need to have opportunities for children to revisit that language, because if we just use it once, it won't be embedded in their memory. So we need to be really, really ambitious when we're thinking about the vocabulary that we want to use with children. And I've put 2 examples of this because they're both schools that I work with. So I was in a nursery and the children were sort of climbing on the sofa to look out into the wooded area next to it, and there was a pigeon outside and they were looking at it, and I made a comment about pigeon, and one of them said, "It's not a pigeon, it's a collared dove." And he was quite right, because there, as they were looking, they really familiar, embedded to their routine, they had the RSPB first book of birds. They had some bird feed outside the window to attract them in, but it wasn't just a bird. It wasn't even a pigeon. It was a collared dove. And an example, this is an example from this is a reception class, actually. An owl has talons, and generally, the reason why that really struck a chord with me was I was looking after a school that was in special measures. The year 4 children had limited experiences before. An experience had been arranged for them to have birds of prey experience. So the children had read some text, done some reading around it. They'd had the birds of prey into school. They'd been through the whole experience. The children had done writing. They were really, really motivated of it. The entire class of year 4 children wrote about the claws of the kestrel or whatever it was, because nobody had taught them the word talons. And that really made all the staff think, when we think about it, that we've got to really carefully think about the vocabulary that we want children to use. And so we've got to plan that in as part of that. So if we think about planning for vocabulary, this is some examples of thinking about some words that we might want to use around water. Now, it says really clearly again, having post-it notes, having words that children can use is not what makes a language-rich environment. But I think having key vocabulary for adults to use is really important. In this is a school, there's no expectation the children can read this key vocabulary. Imagination, pretend, story, character, setting. It is there to remind the adults to use it. It's a really simple laminated piece of paper, and they have it in all different places in the settings, and lots of settings I work with do this. They will have just written vocabulary that they want the adults to focus in when talking to the children. And it might have a particular child's name. It might be this particular child. Actually, we need to focus on using some fundamental vocabulary because he doesn't know the color red. So using that in Play-Doh or in the creative area as part of that. But it's what's the vocabulary that we want adults to use and use repeatedly. And it will evolve as we go through the year and or the time, and it might be different for different children. But the vocabulary isn't written down as just hanging things from the ceiling that children can't read. It is purposeful. And the role of the adults is to use that vocabulary when they are in those areas and they are playing with children. And it can be overwhelming. So one of the things that I do when I do language projects with schools is I say, let's start and agree 5 words we're all going to try and use this week across the setting to begin with. It's absolutely fine. Quite often you're going and the practitioners have got them written on their hands. That's fine. Quite often they have them in little notebooks or in little cards as part of that to remind them. But for it to become embedded in our language, we need to be using it and the children need to be using it repeatedly. And we can't just introduce a word, use it for a short period of time and expect that 6 months later they will all remember it. Some of them might, but they won't all necessarily as part of this. So some examples of some of the language that we might want to use if we're thinking about water. These are some examples of some of the language of sand. And in sand, a shell isn't a shell. It's a mussel or a razor clam or a whelk as part of that, using that specific technical, that tier 3 vocabulary is very specific to this, but also using some of this more general language about mark and bury and fill and tip and measure, and thinking about the language of sand when we're using it and encouraging children to use that language and that vocabulary when they're talking about it. Another one in terms of examples about design and make, which definitely has a link into mathematical vocabulary as part of that, but about thinking about themselves as designers and thinking about cutting and sticking and having that language there and using that language with the children within those areas. Because if we use it as adults with the children, then they will use it themselves and they will use it to other children. And so children will be exposed to more and more language and vocabulary as we go through. Some creative and art ones there as well in terms of this. So some technical language. And again, when we're doing things like printing with children, it's not a leaf, it's an oak leaf or a horse chestnut. So really taking those opportunities to put in that very specific language as part of what we're doing as well. So I'm just scrolling through those examples, but you'll get them afterwards. Small world, about opportunities to talk about emotions as part of that role play would be very similar, and also things that might be linked to the resources that they've got. And we're going to go through and look at some pictures of different different schools and settings now in terms of what they have. So I've got some examples now of how different schools and settings develop vocabulary. This is a school that does transition boxes, and they started during the pandemic in summer 20. This school used to have a massive transition program, and suddenly the children couldn't come in. So we had a long conversation about how do we connect children who haven't had the experience of having that transition. And I think at that point, it's fair to say when we broke up in July 20, we weren't really sure what September 20 was going to be like. And so what they did is every child was sent home a box. And in that box, they had, the school always gives them a school teddy when they join. So it had the school teddy, it had a book. So every child got the same book. And it had a little pot of seeds with the soil and everything you needed to grow it. But it also had this is a box that you're going to personalize all about you with the things that interest you. And the children brought the boxes in on the first day of school. There were 90 children, and they almost all brought them at the beginning, but within about 2 weeks, they'd all brought them, with the exception of a couple, and the staff in the setting made those boxes with those children. So one of the things that they also did was they shifted their transition to so that each child effectively, and again, it was pandemic related, but they still do it. Each child got a 20-minute slot to arrive. They don't have a long transition. And in that 20-minute slot, the parents got to take one-to-one photos with the teacher outside. Parents like to take pictures, don't they? First day at school, they did all the hanging up the clothes, they took the pictures, they did all of that. They talked to the children, they saw their boxes as part of that, and they felt they had a much better one-to-one conversation with the children, and by giving them those slots, and then the children moved into school. But the boxes are kept in the classroom. They're really visible. They stay there for quite a long time. The children get an opportunity to talk about their box to the other children in the class. I have some lovely photos of that, but unfortunately I'm not allowed to share them because I don't have permission to share them in this context as part of that. But then what they also did as they moved towards the half term, they had an event for older brothers and sisters and also families. And they came in and sat around in the hall, and the children moved around with their boxes, and they shared their boxes with others, talking about it and being able to talk about themselves. And it also supported their language baseline assessment in their profile. Storytime boxes. So it talks about the importance of selecting a group of stories that the children are going to read. Here, these are the books that are revisited constantly within this setting. They usually come, there's a bag at the front. So they either come hidden in the bag with that really big excitement about what's the story going to be. And the children choose the books from the box, and they revisit those, and they've really thought carefully about which books they have in terms of the language that they want to introduce to the children. And this class were this class were amazing at reciting Little Rabbit Foo-Foo. But the children thrive on that repetition and get that engagement, and they thought about the language for those children in terms of this. Work with lots of schools that do curiosity cubes. These are all schools that I'm an advisor to. You've probably seen them. The idea of a curiosity cube or a display, it could be that, is it something really exciting and stimulating. The purpose of it is to develop talk about it. It's not necessarily hands-on. The curiosity cubes certainly aren't. The children can't touch the things. But the important thing about that is that it has a high priority, and adults are there to talk to children about it. So they're talking to children about what they can see. They're building in that vocabulary development. In some of the settings, the parents will come in with the children, and it'll be one of the first things they talk about. They're developing those thinking skills around it as part of that. It might link into a particular subject or area that they're looking at as part of that. One of the most fascinating ones I saw earlier in the year, and it was there for a long time, is they'd got a display of fruit, autumnal fruit. There were apples and pears and things, and in the very middle they'd put a plastic fruit, and they all looked pretty much the same. And then as it went through, the children watched the fruit rot inside the curiosity cube, which was just an old fish tank, and the plastic one didn't rot, and the children hadn't even noticed it was a plastic. And those children were so engaged, and their language on that was fascinating in terms of talking about it, but they were also learning so much as part of that. About none of this, the pictures of the settings that I'm telling you, they don't theme areas of provision generally, partly largely due to practitioner workload. What they tend to do is have stimulation areas. So if they have a particular, and these are tadpoles that you can see, they will have one area in which they're focused. You can see it's not vocabulary heavy. It's got lots of photographs to talk about. The tadpoles are there and they're accessible for the children. But again, the important thing is that there will be an adult there to talk to the children. They've got their 5 little frogs at the front. That's one of their core core songs that they learn as part of that. So children will be familiar with that. But the important thing is that there are adults there to talk to children, to look at what's in the photographs and to develop that vocabulary. And they're really clear what the vocabulary they want to get out of that are. And there's some more examples of different ones as part of this that these various settings have done. But the importance of it is that it's not overwhelming with language. There's lots of photographs, but they've thought really carefully about the language, and it's the role of the adult in talking to children. And then when those areas have been in place for a longer time, what you see is that children start to take over and start to have that conversation. About the need for that ambitious vocabulary, I talked about a cow not being a cow, about having different animals, a ring-tailed lemur, looking at the pattern in terms of that. We're going to look at dinosaurs in a minute. Different shells, so we've got oysters and mussels, and they've got limpets on them as part of that. But using that correct vocabulary with children and getting them to use it. About age-appropriate labelling, this particular school has a photograph of every single resource, and that's an example at the top. They're also a White Rose school, you can probably see that. So this is their 2-year-old provision. So they have 2-year-old, 3-year-old, 4-year, and then all the way up. And so they don't overburden children with vocabulary that they can't read. So they use images to start to match, and the children start to put away by putting the resources matched against the pictures. And then as they go through, they will have pictures with really simple words. I'm trying to look whether there's some of them in here. There'll be some as we go on, but they'll have pictures with really simple words. And what they use a lot of photographs, and the vocabulary is there as much to prompt the adults to use it. But it's not overwhelming. It's age appropriate in terms of that. This is a reception workshop by that point. And again, you can see there's an image, there's a photograph, there's the words as part of that. So the vocabulary starts to develop, but it's not lots and lots of words that children can't use. It's built up and it's age appropriate. They have dinosaurs right from their 2-year-old provision. So dinosaurs are a big part of this school. So the 2-year-olds would just put the dinosaur on the silver spot. Then as we go through, you can't see the middle picture very well, but at that point, the children have photographs of the dinosaur toy, and they put them in against that. And then these are some of their reception classes, and the children can tell you it is a triceratops because they know dinosaurs so well, because that language is embedded right in from the beginning as part of that. So they've got the picture and they've got the word and the language as part of that. So they're starting to understand that. Another thing that we had the importance of in terms of this structured was about dialogic reading. And we touched on that again previously, but dialogic reading is about not just reading a story to children, but about that conversation that goes around that book or that story. So it gives children the opportunity to extend their oral language by hearing a story and about talking about it. So there are times when we would want to read a book out loud to a class, and of course that's important, but it's also important that we have quality time to sit and share a book with a child and to talk about it. Really carefully chosen books, front facing, a sofa space on which there's enough space for adults and children to sit and talk. And you see that a lot in nurseries and preschool settings, but you don't so much see space for reception children to talk. And we've looked at that in detail in one of the other courses, and you can go back and look at that. But having those carefully trained, if you're in a setting where you have to take out and put away, you can have that just by having books in baskets that children can flip through and making them forward facing. About thinking about the vocabulary through stories and developing about, are you really clear about which stories, which rhymes, which songs, which poems you want your children to learn and remember as part of that? So there is a really planned journey of taking those children through it. And in this school, you can see, I think this one is the nursery. This one's the reception. You can see the stories that the children have already read are there for them to remember and there for them to talk about, and then they're on the bookshelf for them to read as well as part of this. This is their they have a sort of 2 to 3 year old provision as well, and they have small group spaces, and you can see here. So the children sit around, they have those circular coloured IKEA carpets, and they have group time, and their group time, they mix the ages of the children, not the ages of the children, but the different stages of the children. So it's not just all the children who've just started. So some of the children will be 2, some of them will be 3. And some of them will be 4, and so they plan groups based on lots of different factors that they look at. When a child starts, they'll generally be in a smaller group than adult, but then they'll choose the group that's most appropriate for them. But they have dedicated time to talk in those, but they have their story time in those small groups, and so that allows much more of that dialogic talk. It allows that individual. We know that one-to-one small group, the larger the group gets, the less opportunities there is to talk, the less opportunity there is to develop vocabulary. So these are 4 of their spaces. They've got more than 4 spaces, but you can see that the diet of the books that the children get is exactly the same, whichever group they're in, because these are the books that they've chosen as part of their school journey. About really thinking about, you can see this one, there's the eggs and the incubator. They've also got the 5 Little Ducks, because that's one of their core songs that comes as part of that. So thinking about which songs and which rhymes do we have, and do we teach them to parents? Do we make sure that parents know those as well, so that they can be part of that? We're going to have a look at a video, because as children go on and they become really familiar with those stories and rhymes.
I'll be in a circle, look.
What we're going to do in a circle?
We're gonna jump.
Are we?
We're gonna do cows at the bottom. Cows at the bottom, eating loads of grass. You put your hands down, isn't it?
Cows at the bottom, eating lots of grass.
Eating lots of grass.
1,
2,
3.
This is for our tea.
Fish is for our tea.
This is for our tea. Look, sit down, everybody. We're gonna do a fish pond. When the fish eats some stones, eats some stones, eats some stones, eats some wood, 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 eats some tiny seeds, eats some tiny seeds, eats some tiny seeds, eats some tiny stone, throw them in the nettles, throw them in the nettles, throw them in the lamb, throw them in the soup.
So what we saw in there, she was clearly familiar with, probably down at the bottom of the deep blue sea, catching fishes, but she'd taken that and she twisted that and she's expanded the vocabulary. So that's a really important aspect of that. So a reminder on this stage from the Ofsted blog in 2018, we do not expect to see phonics in continuous provision. It's a time to develop children's talk, play and wider curriculum experiences. A language-rich environment is just about talking with children, not building displays or sticking on post-it notes. So this particular school, one of the things that they do is they don't have loads of signs that children can't read in either nursery or reception. What they do is they have texts within each of their areas of provision. The texts don't tend to change very much, but again, adults will read those books with the children in the areas of provision. Children will read them themselves, and they link into the area. So in a maths area, it will have slightly more of the book will have a mathematical focus as part of that. And you do see children sitting in those areas of provision looking at those books. If we're looking about creating opportunities for talk and thinking about, so it takes we really need to think about what language we're going to plan. So careful, deliberate planning. What do we want the children to know and think about? What's the vocabulary that would link into this? Are we going to use photographs? If we go out on a visit or a trip or have a visitor, and do we take lots of photographs to help children recount? Do we make books? I should have put it, I've got some amazing pictures of whole class books from nursery and reception, where they've made photographic books with the children, based on their experiences, or making a book of a really familiar tale. One of the things when I was a nursery teacher, we always used to start with, the very first thing we used to do when the children started was brown bear, what do you see? And we used to make a whole class book in. So I can see Joe looking at me. Jojo, what do you see? I can see Darren looking at me, for example. And it used to have the children used to take a photograph of themselves, and they used to draw a picture of themselves, and it would have every child in nursery going through that. And as more children joined nursery, it became a really big book in one of those sort of drop-in pouches, and it was the favorite book of the children because they like seeing themselves, they like seeing their name, they like being part of the story, but they loved that twisting on a story and developing that vocabulary and thinking about those songs and those books that we have to really enforce that. The next part of it is about shared narratives. So if we want children to have that to become those skilled readers through having that rich vocabulary, it advocates developing shared narrative. So if we're thinking about shared narrative, it's about the power of repeatedly revisiting a story that all the children in the class or group have heard, building upon that narrative, enabling to explore their responses, to revisit and recreate, to twist, to take it into art or drama or role play, and developing those oral narrative skills, because developing that language. So a long time before children can write, they can orally retell stories. And if children can't orally retell stories, then when they get to the point where they've got all those skills to be a writer, they don't have that rich pool of that narrative upon which to join, so to draw upon as part of that. So it's an opportunity to devise their own stories, and they might be recorded by an adult, or they might be told along. And we're going to look at some examples as we go through about prompts and stories and props to support them in terms of that, about thinking about opportunities to retell stories outside where there's a really big space as part of that, and about thinking about different cultural stories. And we're going to look at a couple of videos which have some shared narratives.
You don't think he's going to eat her? So does he get into the castle? Does Draggy get in? How does he get in?
He's not tall, he's not popping.
He's big, and does he just push the door?
Yeah.
Has he got big, strong hands?
Yeah.
Paws and push like that. Does the door break?
Yeah.
Where's the princess? It's upstairs. She's asleep. So and he hides in it. Oh, she's in her bed. So what does Draggy do?
He don't go.
He goes. He eats her. Oh, he flies away outside. Does he fly away after he's eaten her? Yes. So the princess, is the princess dead?
Yeah.
Oh dear, that's very sad, isn't it? Oh, was she crying? Did she not want Draggy to eat her? No. What will Draggy do next? He'll fly away.
I've got in the wind.
Just go slowly.
And blow away.
You blow away in the wind. Oh, I hope not. Then we'd have no near. Where would you blow to?
Wind.
In the wind?
Yeah.
Where would it take you?
In the castle.
To a castle?
Yeah.
Not the castle where the dragon is.
Yeah.
Do you know that dragon?
Yeah.
Do you know him? Is he scary?
Princess Dragon.
The princess and the dragon.
Princess Dragon.
Oh, that's right. We told the story, didn't we? That's right. Clever boy. So the wind's going to blow you to the castle.
Yeah.
Is the castle far away?
Yeah.
Where is it?
It's blowing you.
Is it? Are you going there now?
Yeah.
Are you going to take it to the yes to the pencil?
Oh,
It's all the bell. It's got to go now. I wonder what you'll find when you get there.
baby's flying then.
She's dead.
Yes,
Is the dragon going to chase her?
yes,
What should she do?
she died.
Could she hide?
Yes, in the bed.
What are you hiding for? Why could she hide?
Where's the rabbit?
And we're going straight into the second one. This is actually on Siren Films as an example of an early learning goal. It has a mixed group of children, so that they're mixed in age.
Sting them.
They had suits on.
They had suits on.
Yeah.
Should we read our story again?
Yeah.
One more time. Nice story. There was a transformer. Then all the transformers came. And then they fighted. And then they kicked. They were fighting because there were baddies. Then they jumped in a bush where stinging nettles are, but they didn't sting them. They had suits on. That's lucky, isn't it? Where could we go next with our story?
Then
Then
they lifted a boulder
lifted a boulder.
by one.
Lifted a boulder by one by one. They lifted a boulder by one. Why did they do that?
Because there was one each carried a boulder.
Because one each carried a boulder. Oh, that sounds like hard work. One each carried a boulder. What was it for?
Joni, I'm telling a story. Can we read it to Joni?
There was a transformer, and then all the transformers came. And then they fighted, and then they kicked. They were fighting because there were baddies.
They're not baddies.
What, did I get that bit wrong?
Yes,
They were fighting because
there was baddies there.
there was baddies there. Baddies there. I'll make that correction, yeah? There was baddies there. Then they jumped in a bush where stinging nettles are, but they didn't sting them. They had suits on. And then they lifted a boulder one by one, because one carried a boulder. One each carried a boulder.
Yeah.
So what were these boulders for?
And they were going to throw them on the baddies.
They were going to throw the boulders.
Yeah, at the baddies.
They were going
to throw the boulders at the baddies.
to throw
The boulders at the baddies.
okey-doke, at the baddies.
To throw the boulders.
This story is getting bigger and bigger and more complicated as we go.
And
There we go, to throw the boulders at the baddies.
yeah,
How do the baddies think about that? How do they feel about that one?
really angry. And then they just threw the boulders at them.
And what happened after that?
The end.
The end. The end.
My turn. My turn.
The end. Should we give it one more read?
So 2 examples on that one of shared narrative, one oral and one where the adult was writing down for the children. We're almost at the end of the session, just a little bit of a flag about reminding about the need to support parents. We talked about it earlier, but supporting parents in terms of making sure that they have access to high quality texts for their children at home, about supporting parents with language development, about talking to them about the importance of contingent talk and talking to their children. This is an example of where the children come in for stay and play before they come in, and they have to go around and find those things in terms of the school nursery. So just to plug the importance of supporting parents. And I think the final bit is to think about in terms of reflection. So thinking about how do you prioritize the specific vocabulary that it's most crucial for the children to understand and to be able to use and to remember. And how do you make sure that children remember that vocabulary over time? Have you thought about the books, rhymes and songs that you specifically want to use in your setting to support pupils' language and vocabulary development? Are there any particular teaching approaches that you want to use as a whole school setting? Because a whole school approach or whole setting approach is really important. So, you know, what's our approach to interaction with adults? What's the role of the adult when they're in the role play? How do we support language development? So thinking about those things, about making sure that there's dedicated times for stories each day, and about really thinking about, we went right back to the beginning where we thought about how that language gap is so well embedded between children who are exposed to lots of language and those who aren't by the time they're 4.5. So actually, whatever age children are joining us, we need to know where they are in terms of their language development, and we need to be supporting children who are behind their peers to catch up and to keep up. And as I always say, one of the things that I do is when I go on courses, I always think about what's going to be my next step. And then I write it in my diary a month in advance or 2 months in advance so that I can think about, so what are the 1 or 2 small things that I'm going to do differently as a result of this? And then I put myself a reminder in my diary in a couple of months' time so I can go back and reflect on it and think, well, did I do it? And did it work? And if and is there something else I'd like to try that came from that? And that's the end of my input for today.